The morning air smelled like turned earth and diesel fuel when I first saw her standing at my fence line. White capris, spotless tennis shoes, clipboard clutched like a weapon. She was staring at my barn the way health inspectors look at restaurant kitchens before they find violations. I was halfway through replacing a rotted fence post hole digger still in my hands, when she called out, "Excuse me, are you the property owner?" I straightened, wiped sweat from my forehead with the back of my work glove. "That's right." She didn't introduce herself, just tapped her pen against the clipboard. "I'm conducting a property assessment for the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. Your barn is visible from several homes in our community, and frankly, the aesthetic is—" She paused, searching for the word. "Inconsistent with our neighborhood standards." I looked back at the barn. 100-year-old timber frame, weathered red paint, functional as the day it was built. Then I looked at the fence line between us. My fence line, a good 30 yards inside my property boundary. "This isn't Meadowbrook Heights," I said. "I'm aware. However, visual pollution affects property values regardless of jurisdiction." Visual pollution. I'd heard a lot of things in 15 years of farming, but that was new. "Appreciate the feedback," I said, and went back to digging. She didn't leave. I could feel her standing there, clipboard arm crossed over her chest, waiting for me to acknowledge whatever authority she thought she had. When I didn't look up again, she made a small noise of disapproval and walked back toward the development, and I should have paid more attention to that moment, should have recognized the particular brand of entitlement that doesn't understand the word no. But I had 60 acres to manage, livestock to feed, and a tractor with a hydraulic leak that needed addressing before the afternoon feeding. One annoying neighbor didn't register as a problem worth my time. The fence post went in clean. I tamped the soil, tested the stability, moved on to the next section. By noon, I'd forgotten about her entirely. It was 3 days later when I found the first note. Tucked under my windshield wiper, printed on HOA letterhead, outlining voluntary compliance suggestions for my property. The barn needed painting. The equipment shed was an eyesore. My gravel driveway created dust that migrated into the development. I read it twice, and then used it to wrap some wire I was storing in the truck bed. The second note appeared a week after that. This one mentioned fines, actual dollar amounts for non-compliance. I called the county assessor's office that afternoon, confirmed what I already knew. My property predated the development by 40 years, sat outside HOA boundaries, and wasn't subject to a single one of their regulations. I wrote, "Not in your HOA" across the letter in marker, and stuck it on the fence post where she'd been standing. That should have been the end of it. But the thing about people like her, people who've spent years in positions of small authority, who've grown accustomed to compliance through persistence, is that they don't hear no as a complete sentence. They hear it as an opening position in a negotiation they're certain they'll win. I didn't know her name yet, didn't know she'd just been elected HOA president, or that she'd interpreted that election as a mandate to expand her domain beyond any reasonable boundary. I just knew that when I came back from the feed store that evening, there were tire tracks in my front pasture that didn't belong to any of my vehicles. Someone had driven onto my property, through my gate, across ground I'd specifically reseeded 2 weeks earlier. I stood there looking at those tracks as the sun dropped behind the tree line, and something cold settled in my chest. This wasn't over. The trouble started 3 weeks after the HOA's annual meeting, when Karen Whitmore ascended to the presidency, with the kind of fervor usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. She'd campaigned on a platform of community standards and property value protection, which translated in practice to an obsessive need to control everything within a 5-mile radius of her perfectly manicured lawn. The HOA governed the cookie-cutter development that had sprouted up along the eastern edge of the county 5 years ago. 200 homes of identical beige siding and regulation mailboxes. all bound by a covenant thicker than most religious texts. Your farm predated the development by 60 years. Your property line ran along the western fence of the HOA territory, a clear legal boundary marked by survey stakes and a decent barbed wire fence you'd maintained since your grandfather's time. The farm wasn't subject to HOA rules, never had been, never would be. Karen didn't see it that way. Her first visit came on a Tuesday morning. You were mucking out the horse stalls when you heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A white Lexus SUV, pristine, gleaming, utterly out of place, rolled up your access road and stopped 20 feet from the barn. She stepped out wearing white capris and a coral blouse, sunglasses perched on her head, carrying a leather portfolio like she was showing real estate. She didn't knock, didn't call out, just walked directly into your open barn and stood there, nose wrinkled, surveying the interior like a health inspector who'd already written the citation. "Excuse me," you said, setting down the pitchfork. "Can I help you?" "I'm Karen Whitmore, HOA president." She extended no hand. "I'm here to discuss your property's impact on our community standards." You blinked. My property isn't in the HOA." "That's a technicality." She pulled a paper from her portfolio. "Your barn is visible from several homes in the development. The paint is peeling, the roof has moss. Frankly, it's an eyesore that affects our property values. It's a 100-year-old barn, on my land. I'm prepared to offer a compromise." She set the paper on a hay bale. "Your hay bale, in your barn, on your property. If you repaint within 30 days and install privacy screening along the fence line, we can avoid escalation." The document was titled Voluntary Compliance Agreement. It had signature lines, dates, a clause about future inspections. "I'm not signing anything," you said. "You need to leave." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'd hate for this to become adversarial. We have resources, legal counsel, connections with code enforcement. And I have property rights. This conversation is over." She collected her paper with theatrical slowness, making a show of photographing the barn interior with her phone. "I'll be back," she said. "We take community standards very seriously." She left, her SUV kicking up dust that settled on everything you'd just cleaned. You figured that was the end of it. A busybody who'd overstepped, been corrected, and would move on. You were wrong. The next week, a code enforcement officer showed up, apologetic, explaining he'd received multiple complaints about livestock odors and unsanitary conditions. He walked the property, found nothing, and left with a shrug and a "sorry for wasting your time." 3 days later, another visit, this time about unapproved structures. Again, nothing. Then Karen's SUV appeared again, parked at your gate while she took photographs of your chicken coop from your driveway. She'd made her position clear. The boundary between her authority and your property was, in her mind, negotiable. It was going to be a long summer. The first time Karen drove onto the property, Tom figured it was a mistake. Maybe she'd gotten turned around on the rural roads, confused the gravel drive for someone else's. He was loading feed bags into the barn when her white Lexus SUV crunched up the lane, and he'd walked over with a neighborly wave, ready to give directions. She'd rolled down her window and handed him a printed notice. "Your fence violates HOA aesthetic standards, Section 4.7, subsection C. You have 14 days to repaint or replace." Tom had looked at the paper, then at her, and then at the fence, a perfectly functional split rail that had stood for 30 years. "Mom, I'm not in your HOA. Property values affect everyone in the area. The notice stands." She'd driven off before he could explain that her authority ended at her own mailbox. That was June. By July, she'd been back 6 times. She arrived unannounced, always during the workday, when Tom was mid-task. She'd park wherever she pleased, sometimes blocking the barn entrance, once directly in front of the chicken coop, and walk the property with a clipboard, photographing things. The compost pile, the equipment shed, the perfectly legal rainwater collection barrels. Each visit came with a new citation printed on HOA letterhead. The barn needed fresh paint. The tractor was an eyesore. The vegetable garden was unstructured and chaotic. Tom kept every notice in a folder, documenting dates and times, but he didn't respond. You couldn't argue with someone who believed their authority extended beyond the boundaries of reality. August brought escalation. Karen started arriving with other HOA board members in tow, reluctant-looking people who stayed in their cars while she marched around taking notes. She'd begun calling the county code enforcement office weekly, reporting violations that didn't exist. Tom knew because the inspector, a patient man named Rodriguez, had started apologizing when he showed up. "I know this is harassment," Rodriguez had said during his 4th visit, "but I have to respond to every complaint. For the record, you're not violating a single code." "Can you tell her that?" "I have." "All 3 times?" Rodriguez had looked genuinely tired. "She says she'll go to the county commissioner if I don't take her seriously." The visits became more invasive. Karen let herself into the barn once, claiming she needed to verify livestock conditions. Tom had found her photographing the interior, her heels sinking into the dirt floor. Another time she'd opened the gate to the south pasture, letting 3 goats wander onto the road before Tom noticed. She'd claimed the latch was faulty. The latch had worked fine for a decade. September was when she started blocking the access road. She'd park her Lexus perpendicular to the gate, then walk the property for an hour while Tom's work ground to halt. Couldn't get the feed truck in, couldn't move equipment, couldn't do anything but wait for her to finish her inspection and leave. He'd asked her to move. She'd cited some invented authority about community safety assessments. He'd called the non-emergency police line twice. Both times she'd been gone before the deputy arrived. The folder of citations grew thicker. Tom's patience grew thinner. His neighbors in the actual HOA development started apologizing when they saw him in town. Apparently, Karen had been telling people he was hostile to community standards and refusing to cooperate with basic requests. By October, Tom had started keeping his phone camera ready. Every visit got documented now. Date, time, duration, what she touched, where she parked. He'd learned that much from Rodriguez. Paper trails mattered. What Tom didn't tell anyone was that he'd also started sketching designs in the margins of his feed orders. Measurements, angles, weight calculations. Medieval engineering principles applied to modern problems. Sometimes you had to get creative about defending your property. The call came at 4:47 in the morning. Doc Harrison's voice was calm but urgent. Clover, the pregnant mare, was in distress. Breach presentation. He could be there in 20 minutes if the roads were clear. I threw on boots and a jacket, already moving toward the barn. The pre-dawn air was sharp and cold. My breath, visible in the floodlight, spilled from the equipment shed. Clover was on her feet in the foaling stool, sides heaving, eyes showing too much white. I'd been checking her every few hours through the night, and now the moment had arrived wrong. "Easy girl, Doc's coming." My hand found her neck. Her coat was dark with sweat, and I heard the engine before I saw the headlights. Doc's truck coming up the access road fast. Then the headlights stopped. Just stopped, maybe 200 yards from the barn, right at the gate. I stepped out of the barn. In the growing light, I could see Doc's truck idling at the closed gate, and blocking it, parked perpendicular across the entire entrance, was Karen's white SUV. She was standing beside it in a bathrobe and duck boots, arms crossed. I ran. "Move the vehicle!" I didn't shout it, didn't have the breath. "I'm conducting an inspection. You can't just have vehicles coming and going at all hours without proper—" "I have a veterinary emergency. Move, now!" Doc Harrison had gotten out of his truck. He was 72 years old and carried a medical bag that probably weighed 40 pounds. The gate was chain link. They're 8 feet tall. He looked at it, looked at Karen's SUV, and started calculating whether he could climb. "I don't see any emergency," Karen said. I see a pattern of disregard for community standards and there's a horse dying. My voice came out flat. You're blocking medical access. This isn't an HOA property, so there's no such thing as medical access regulations here. If you'd simply agreed to voluntary compliance months ago, Doc Harrison had his phone out. I'm calling the sheriff. Go ahead. I'm well within my rights to ensure. I turned and ran back to the barn. Clover was down now, on her side, breathing wrong. I grabbed the bolt cutters from the tool wall, the heavy ones I used for fence repair. Sprinted back to the gate. Karen saw me coming. You can't. Those are for the chain, aren't they? That's destruction of. I cut the chain. The gate swung open. Doc Harrison was already moving, bag in hand, squeezing past Karen's SUV. I'm calling the police. Karen's voice went shrill. This is assault on my freedom of movement. This is. Doc was in the barn. I followed. Karen's voice faded behind us. Clover's breathing had gone shallow. Doc didn't waste time talking, just moved with the efficiency of 5 decades of practice. He knelt in the straw, hands already assessing, already working. Hold her head. Talk to her. I did. Clover's eye rolled toward me, and I kept my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. Doc worked. The barn was silent except for Clover's breathing, and the small sounds of Doc's movements, and Karen's distant voice still shouting something about property rights and legal action. Now it took 40 minutes. When the foal finally came, a filly, dark bay, perfect. Doc sat back in the straw and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. Close, he said quietly. Clover was already nosing her baby, making the low, nickering sound that meant everything was going to be all right. Outside, I could hear a siren. The sheriff, finally. And Karen's voice, louder now, explaining to someone how she'd been assaulted with bolt cutters. I looked at Doc Harrison. He looked at the foal, then at me. That woman, he said, is going to kill someone someday. The idea came to me 3 days after the vet incident, while I was stacking hay bales in the barn. My hands were still shaking with residual anger every time I thought about Daisy's labored breathing. The vet's truck idling helplessly on the road, and Karen's smug face behind her steering wheel. I set down the bale I was holding and looked at the pulley system I used for lifting feed sacks to the loft. Physics. Leverage. Counterweight. The same principles that had moved stones for castles could certainly move other things. I told myself I was just thinking. Just working through the mechanics as a mental exercise. By that evening, I had sketched out rough plans on the back of a feed receipt. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store in town. I bought timber, heavy-duty rope, industrial bolts, and a come-along winch. The kid at the register asked what I was building. Hay bale launcher, I said, for getting bales up to the upper pasture without hauling them by hand. He nodded like that made perfect sense. Farm equipment comes in all shapes, and I spent the first week building the frame in the equipment barn, away from the main road. The structure rose slowly, a heavy wooden A-frame with a long throwing arm, counterweighted with a barrel I could fill with concrete or water depending on how much force I needed. I welded the pivot point myself, taking my time to ensure it would swing smooth and true. I told myself it was therapeutic. Woodworking always cleared my head. By the second week, I had the arm balanced and the release mechanism installed. A simple pin system I could trigger with a rope pull from a safe distance. I tested it with a hay bale first. The bale arced beautifully through the air and landed 40 feet away in the empty pasture. I adjusted the counterweight, tested again. 60 feet this time. My neighbor, old Tom from 2 properties over, and stopped by on his way past. He leaned on the fence and watched me crank the arm down for another test. That's some hay bale launcher you got there, he said. Gets the job done, I replied. Looks a bit like a trebuchet to me. Does it? I examined my work as if seeing it for the first time. I suppose the principles are similar. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then, heard Karen's been giving you trouble. She's been trespassing. Shame about your vet emergency. Yes, it is. Tom nodded slowly. He pulled a tobacco tin from his pocket, tucked a pinch in his cheek. You know, I built something similar once, back in my engineering days. Calculated that a counterweight of about 400 pounds could launch a payload of roughly 3,000 pounds about 40 feet. Though depending on the arm length and release angle. I met his eyes. That's very specific information. Just thinking out loud. He spat into the dirt. Also thinking that if someone were to, say, attach straps to something instead of just launching it loose, the trajectory would be more controlled. Less chance of the payload separating mid-flight. Hypothetically, Tom tipped his hat. Nice talking to you. Hope your trespassing problem resolves itself. He walked back to his truck, and I returned to my work. I spent the third week fine-tuning. I installed heavy-duty towing straps to the throwing arm, the kind rated for vehicle recovery. I practiced the release mechanism until I could trigger it smoothly in under 3 seconds. I set up my security cameras to cover every angle of the front gate and access road. I told myself I was just being prepared. The trebuchet sat ready in the equipment barn, the counterweight barrel filled with water, the throwing arm cranked down and locked, waiting. All I needed now was the right moment. The morning arrived with that particular quality of light that makes every farmer check the weather instinctively. Clear skies, no wind. The kind of day where you could hear a truck coming from half a mile away. Which is exactly what happened at 9:47 a.m. The white SUV rolled down the county road with the confidence of someone who believed rules were suggestions for other people. It turned onto the access road, my access road, and parked at an angle that blocked the gate completely. Not beside it, not near it, across it, like a middle finger rendered in German engineering and pearl white paint. So Karen stepped out wearing what I'd come to think of as her inspection outfit. Pressed khakis, a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on it, and sunglasses that probably cost more than my tractor's last repair bill. She carried a clipboard and her phone, already raised to take photos of whatever agricultural sins she'd decided to prosecute today. I was in the barn, watching through the gap in the boards. My phone was recording. The camera mounted on the fence post was recording. The one on the barn was recording. I'd learned documentation mattered more than satisfaction. She walked past the gate without opening it, ducking under the fence rail instead. Trespassing. Again. The 40th time by my count, though I'd stopped tracking after 35. I gave her 5 minutes to wander into the far pasture. I'm photographing the unsightly hay bales and the non-compliant fence posts that had stood there since before her subdivision was a developer's wet dream. Then I walked to the trebuchet. The straps were already in position, coiled like sleeping snakes beside the machine. I'd practiced this part a dozen times with hay bales and old equipment, calculating weight distribution and trajectory until I could predict the landing zone within a 6-foot radius. The SUV sat there, gleaming and oblivious. I attached the first strap to the rear axle, threading it through and pulling it tight. The second went around the front frame, secured with a knot I'd learned from a sailing manual. The third and fourth acted as stabilizers, keeping the vehicle level during the initial lift. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. I'd expected adrenaline, and maybe doubt. Instead, there was only the calm focus that comes from knowing you've checked every variable twice. I called the non-emergency line, gave them my name, address, and a clear statement. Active trespasser on my property, vehicle blocking emergency access, requesting officer response. The dispatcher said someone would be there in 20 to 30 minutes. I thanked her and hung up. Karen was still in the far pasture, probably measuring the distance between fence posts to cite some violation that didn't apply to me. The counterweight hung ready, 2,000 pounds of concrete and steel in a mesh cage. I'd tested the release mechanism that morning, oiling the pin until it moved with almost no resistance. I walked to the control rope, wrapped it once around my hand. The sun was warm on my shoulders. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding a thermal that wouldn't exist in another hour. I pulled. The pin released with a metallic click. The counterweight dropped. The throwing arm rose with the kind of inexorable momentum that makes you understand why medieval armies feared these machines. The SUV lifted off the ground, straps going taut with a sound like a sail catching wind. For one impossible moment it hung suspended, all 2 tons of it, wheels still spinning slightly from where they'd left the earth. Then the arm reached its apex and the vehicle flew. It sailed over the fence, over the drainage ditch, and into the pig wallow with a sound I will remember until the day I die. A deep, wet splorch that sent mud geysering 20 feet into the air. The pig scattered, outraged. The SUV settled at a 45-degree angle, a nose down in 3 feet of mud and pig shit, its rear wheels pointing at the sky like a surrender. I stood there, rope still in my hand, and watched Karen sprint back across the pasture, screaming words I couldn't quite make out, but could definitely imagine. The SUV hung in the air for what felt like an impossible moment, a gleaming white luxury vehicle suspended against the autumn sky, like some absurd modern art installation. Then physics remembered its job. The impact was everything I'd calculated, and nothing I could have truly prepared for. The sound alone, a wet, thunderous crack, followed by the deep suction of mud accepting 3,000 pounds of German engineering, echoed across the valley. A geyser of black muck erupted upward, raining down in thick droplets that pattered against the barn roof 30 feet away. Karen's scream cut through the settling silence. She'd been standing near the fence line, clipboard in hand, mid-sentence about unauthorized agricultural structures. Now she stood frozen, mouth open, watching her vehicle settle at a 45-degree angle in what was technically the wettest section of the pig wallow. The hogs, for their part, seemed delighted by this new addition to their habitat. Beatrice, my largest sow, immediately began investigating the rear bumper. You... Karen's face had gone beyond red into some new color I didn't have a name for. You launched my car. I pulled out my phone, checking the timestamp on the recording. Actually, Mom, you're still trespassing. I called the sheriff's department 17 minutes ago. They should be here soon. Trespassing. That's a $60,000 vehicle. That you parked on my property, again, after multiple warnings. I gestured to the clearly visible no trespassing signs. Also, you're standing about 15 feet past the property line right now. She looked down at her feet as if the ground itself might betray her, then back at the SUV. The passenger side was completely submerged. Mud had already seeped through the door seals. I could see it oozing across the leather interior through the driver's side window. This is assault. Destruction of property. I'm calling my lawyer. You do that. I kept my voice level, almost bored. While you're at it, maybe ask them about the legal implications of repeatedly trespassing, blocking emergency access, and harassment. I've got 6 months of documentation. The sound of tires on gravel announced Deputy Morrison's arrival. He stepped out of his cruiser, took one look at the scene, and I watched him fight the smile. He lost. Mom, he said, walking over to Karen, while carefully staying on the correct side of the property line. We've talked about this. He catapulted my vehicle. Arrest him. Morrison looked at the trebuchet, then at me, then at the SUV settling deeper into the muck, with a slow, obscene squelching sound. Sir, you want to explain what happened here? Equipment malfunction, Deputy. I was testing the hay bale launcher, completely legitimate agricultural equipment, and Mrs. Henderson's vehicle was parked in the trajectory path, on my property, without permission. A hay bale launcher. Morrison's voice was carefully neutral. For moving heavy feed bales to the back pastures, much more efficient than the tractor in muddy conditions. Karen made a sound like a kettle boiling over. That is not... Ma'am, were you on his property? Morrison cut her off. I was conducting an HOA inspection. On property that's not in your HOA. The rules clearly state, "Mom, we've been through this 4 times now." Morrison's patience was audibly thinning. This is his land. You can't just drive onto someone's private property. I pulled up my phone. I've got the whole thing recorded, Deputy, including the 17-minute window between my call and your arrival, during which she remained on my property, and the part where she admitted she was here for an inspection. Morrison sighed. Mom, I'm going to need you to step over here. The SUV settled another inch deeper. Somewhere in the wallow, Beatrice grunted contentedly. This was going to be a long afternoon. The sheriff's deputy closed his notepad with a decisive snap. Karen stood beside her mud-caked SUV. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, her white blazer now the color of wet cardboard. The tow truck driver was already hooking chains to the front axle, shaking his head at the angle of the thing. Nose down, rear wheels still 2 feet off the ground where they'd landed on the berm of the wallow. Mom, the deputy said, and his voice had gone flat in that particular way that meant he was done being patient. You are on private property, without permission, for the 4th documented time this month. The fact that his equipment malfunctioned while you were trespassing is not his problem. It's yours. Karen opened her mouth. The deputy raised one hand. You can file a civil suit if you want. But I'm telling you right now you won't win. And if you set foot on this property again without written permission, I'll arrest you myself. Are we clear? She didn't answer. Just turned and walked toward the road, her heels sinking into the soft earth with every step. I watched her go. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. The tow truck dragged the SUV free with a long, wet sucking sound. Mud sloughed off the doors in thick sheets. The driver gave me a thumbs up as he winched it onto the flatbed. That's going to be a hell of a cleaning bill, he said, grinning. Not my circus, I said. Not my monkeys. He laughed and drove off. By evening, the HOA had called an emergency meeting. I didn't attend, wasn't a member, didn't care. But Linda from the feed store texted me the highlights. Karen had been asked to step down as president. Not forced. Asked. But the kind of asking that comes with 3 board members standing behind you with their arms crossed. She'd refused at first. Then someone had pulled up the county property maps on a laptop and shown the whole room exactly where the HOA boundaries ended and my farm began. Turns out half the board hadn't realized Karen had been conducting her inspections on land the HOA had no authority over. The vote to remove her was unanimous. 2 days later, I got a certified letter. Official HOA letterhead. New president's signature at the bottom. Dear Mr. Hutchins, on behalf of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, we apologize for any confusion regarding property boundaries and jurisdiction. Please be assured that no further contact will be made regarding your farm, its structures, or its operations. We recognize and respect your property rights. Additionally, we have updated our governing documents to clearly define the limits of HOA authority. We hope this resolves any outstanding concerns. I pinned it to the corkboard in the barn, right next to the vet's invoice from the emergency call and the photo I'd printed of the SUV mid-flight. The trebuchet stayed up for another week. Not because I needed it, because I wanted to. Because every time I walked past it, I remembered what it felt like to stop being polite and start being clear. Eventually I dismantled it, saved the timber. You never know when you'll need to build something. As Karen moved 3 months later, sold her house to a retired couple who introduced themselves by bringing over a pie and asking if I needed any help with the fence line. I told them I didn't, but I appreciated the offer. The farm went back to being quiet. The animals grazed. The barn stood exactly as unsightly as it had always been, and the gate stayed closed unless I was the one opening it. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the creak of the counterweight releasing, the whoosh of the arm, the distant splash, best sound I ever built.